It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. You can get a hold of me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting if you email me at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. Our archives are free at Spreaker.com. I do a live show there every Friday night, 8 p.m. And if you go there and just put in the name John Potash or Drugs as Weapons Against Us or Tupac, you'll come up with many, many shows I've done with the great John Potash. He had a film about 6 years ago called Drugs as Weapons Against Us. Award-winning film, excellent documentary film, and he just did a sequel to it that's even better, CIA Drugs Are Us. Mr. John Potash, are you there?
Yes, thanks for having me on again, Ed.
Oh, it's a pleasure, always. You can find John at johnpotash.com, and also you can find a link to the films here, drugsasweapons.com. So, John, before we get into the new film here, CIA Drugs Are Us, tell us about yourself. Who is John Potash?
Yeah, so I've been working in counseling most of my life, doing drug counseling. Started as a drug counselor when I graduated with a degree in psychology. In 1989, I started as an addictions counselor, and then got my master's and started doing more counseling in other areas, and developed an expertise with trauma around after getting trained in EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is, I think, the best technique for dealing with trauma, but also deal with many other psychological issues for people. And so I've been a psychotherapist for about 35 years or so now, and in my off time, as my avocation, I've been investigating different subjects. I wrote a number of articles, and then ended up publishing the book, The FBI War on Tupac Shakur and Black Leaders, in 2007. And that had started as a kind of a section of another book that was much bigger that I'd been working on, which ended up becoming, which I came out with in 2015 under Trine Day Publishing, which was Drugs as Weapons Against Us, the CIA's murderous targeting of SDS, Panthers, Hendrix, Lennon, Cobain, Tupac, and other activists. And you have that long subtitle just so that it beats the censors, and the terms get out there to many people so they can find the book, because there is a lot of censorship along the way. And so I made a very low-budget film about the Tupac book, The FBI War on Tupac Shakur and Black Leaders, and it's been republished as just The FBI on Tupac Shakur, FBI War on Tupac Shakur, State Repression of Black Leaders, and that's by Microcosm Publishing. But I also made the film, as you mentioned, of Drugs as Weapons Against Us, the CIA War on Musicians and Activists, and came out with that in 2019. Gravitas Ventures distributed that for me, and which I'm really happy about, and then came out with a film, Shots, about the pandemic with its, I argue, the origins in eugenics, and then came out with this film I haven't come out with yet, but it's supposed to be out October 8th, which is CIA Drugs Are Us, a Drugs as Weapons sequel. And both my Shots film and this film are, a kind of dark comedy, so that people, can get through the darkness with just some levity and, hopefully find it entertaining despite how, harsh a lot of these issues are.
You mentioned censorship. Your Shots film, how was that received? Did you have a lot of opposition with that one?
Lots. Oh, yeah, lots. It's some bizarre things happen with that where I got a distributor, MVD Entertainment Group, which were really good and pitched it to, 55 or more different platforms. And granted, maybe I think a dozen platforms showed it, but the biggest ones censored it, but it's being shown on Tubi, which gets it out to a lot of people, and so that's very nice, and being sold. The film DVD, physical DVDs being sold on Amazon, but Amazon Prime said there was a publishing error, and they couldn't put it out there on Prime, so I don't know what that was about. but then YouTube rented it to people, but said they couldn't show the trailer. So it doesn't look like you can rent it, on YouTube because they banned the trailer, saying it's false information or something like that. So that's really bizarre, and that's just some of the ways these things happen with it. Google Play presents it, but not many people watch Google Play films, and and other platforms that are smaller show it, but it's just too bad that there's that censorship that's kind of hiding it a bit from everyone except people that watch it on Tubi. But lots of people have watched it on Tubi, thankfully, and give me good feedback on it. So I'm happy about that.
Yeah, the YouTube censorship is just unbelievable. It makes no sense.
Yeah.
Just they pick up a word, and then the whole thing's gone. Now,
right.
I haven't had you back. The first time I had you on the show was about Tupac, the murder of Tupac
right.
Shakur, and I haven't had you back since there was been an arrest recently and all of that. So, what's the update on Tupac?
Yeah, so the update on Tupac is going, I talk a little bit about, the main substance that I covered in the book and then, the film Drugs as Weapons Against Us. But the updated stuff is this, this kind of ridiculous police arrest after, I guess, 2 decades or so, or more. I guess, well, it's been more than that. It's been almost 3 decades now since his death. And, the main guy I focus on, one of the main investigators, was a honest police officer, named Russell Poole, who was a high-level Los Angeles police detective, and he came to find that his fellow officers were involved in Tupac Shakur's murder, and that Biggie's murder was, they call it collateral damage, to hide their murder of Tupac, and also make it look like some kind of East Coast, West Coast rap war. But he ends up dying mysteriously, and I couldn't really get into this. I got into it in my latest version of the Tupac book, but the FBI warned Tupac Shakur, but I couldn't really cover it in my film. But what I did cover is the fact that at some point before his death, U.S. intelligence appeared to put this guy, Greg Kading, out there with a supposedly independent, written book of his own investigation, and they apparently said they got him to investigate the Tupac Shakur murder, and he comes to find he offers lots to a gang member, Dwayne Keefe D. Davis, or Keith, I forget his first name exactly all of a sudden, but so this Keefe D. Davis says, gets let off of major drug dealing charges that could have gotten him life in prison, and this is all according to Kading himself. I have him in the movie saying this, and so he's let off completely of these major charges just to say that him and given him total immunity just to confess that him and his nephew, he says, Orlando Anderson, killed Tupac, and it's such a joke. I show Kading, I show Poole telling that Kading was a disgraced police officer caught in court lying, and he never talked to Poole whatsoever in supposedly reinvestigating what Poole already investigated in this case and doing an honest investigation. And then, of course, you end up finding out that people catch him lying about 2 major things, and so I show that in my film. And and Keefe D, what he says about the whole event is a total joke. It's just makes it virtually impossible for it to have happened. And so I just had to expose that, even though most of the public don't know what to believe at this point. Half the public probably may believe that Keefe D. Davis really did kill Tupac. But I think I'd like to think that a major portion of the public has read my work and knows, or has seen or heard about my work at least, and knows that this is a joke cover-up. And I think a lot of the public does know that this is a joke cover-up, and that's why a lot of people just dismiss it.
And your angle on this is more from the point of view of Afeni Shakur and Matula Shakur. It's
the fact that the family were incredible activists. The whole family, they'd worked with Malcolm X, and then they worked, were leading Black Panthers. They were leading the kind of the real fight against drugs, the drugs and addictions with acupuncture.
Right.
And so, the FBI had gone after that family in a huge way, imprisoned Tupac Shakur, a great acupuncturist, revolutionizing acupuncture against addiction, and also targeted Afeni Shakur, the one-time Harlem Black Panther leader, for, under the FBI's counterintelligence program, which has been well documented in the FBI files, and activists stole those files and revealed this counterintelligence program against the Black Panthers. And, the FBI pretends to have stopped that program, but whistleblowers have said, like M. Wesley Swearingen has said that in his own memoir in 1995, that program, that COINTEL program was still happening, at least until the 1990s while Tupac was alive. And so obviously showed the evidence that it was used against him, Tupac, because Tupac was joining his Black Panther extended family in trying to get the Bloods and Crips to call peace truces and turn on to activism. And for that, he was seriously targeted, and he was doing other activist things too. He was a one-time leader of a national group called the New African Panthers. He was a one-time chairman of that group, and that put him under the microscope of U.S. intelligence. And thus, that's why they attempted to kill him about at least 4 or 5 times before they were successful. And so.
And his stepfather, Tupac Shakur, just released from prison on some totally bogus charges, some bank robbery charges, where he had no connection whatsoever, except that they were going to donate some money to him, allegedly. Spent his life in prison. He just passed away. He was released from prison and passed away?
Yeah, it's very sad. The only reason they released him from prison, they didn't release him when his parole was supposed to be completely up. They kept him in prison anyway. And then finally, a judge released him, gave him what they call a compassionate release, because he was dying of cancer, and he was supposed to die within a month or two, and he thankfully got to live a little longer, 8 or 9 months, I think, more. But it's very sad, though, that he only gets less than a year out of prison after being decades in prison on what I believe is a false charge. So.
Well, he had no connection to the actual crime. That's a fact.
Yeah.
Anyway,
right.
So back to CIA Drugs Are Us. Now, you cover so much material. Manson Family, the SDS, the Dave McGowan work. It's like a who's who of the Opperman reports. So many of our guests we've had on this show you talk about in this film. Why don't you take us through the thread? What are you trying to tell us with this film? What's the thread of all these stories? Yeah,
the thread of the stories is basically how the CIA, through this project MK Ultra, which is a huge umbrella project with 149 sub-projects, used drugs to manipulate the masses. And basically, in some ways that might be most interesting to certain people is that they kind of manipulated musicians with drugs in order to try to get them to popularize the drugs. And sadly enough, when they threatened to become sober and promote, activism, anti-war activism and anti-racist activism, some of these musicians were murdered, I believe, by U.S. intelligence. And I show that with a thread of Tupac Shakur, but also John Lennon and Kurt Cobain. And so now with the activists, I focus on, I also focus on the kind of fake U.S. intelligence undercover possible musicians, and with some of the stuff that Dave McGowan pioneered first with the Laurel Canyon scene, and how they would use these Laurel Canyon parties with these musicians that were in the families of the military and in the families of these oligarchs, the wealthiest oligarchs in our country, gave them huge prominence, and then had them have constant sex and drug parties in the Laurel Canyon scene of Los Angeles in the 1960s and 70s, and try to introduce drugs, heroin, cocaine, LSD, and other drugs to tons of celebrities, whether it be actors and musicians, to get them to promote drugs to the masses. And that's basically just to kind of manipulate the masses in general more, but also to sideline activists, hurt people's lives so that they can have more control over people when they're either addicted or brain-addled from some of the drugs that hurt their minds, or, just have them under the thumb of the law and things like that. So that use of drugs as weapons against us is the theme throughout, and so it goes through there. Now, also overlapping, this movie, as opposed to drugs as weapons against us, gets more into the brainwashing aspect of things. And brainwashing sounds like sci-fi, but it's really just using drugs plus hypnosis to, manipulate someone's mind. And so there's, I use CIA documents that discuss this and their success with this, even though they pretend like they weren't successful with this. Loads of research shows they were. And so that gets into the Manson family. And so Tom O'Neill was a mainstream reporter for, I think it was Premier Magazine, when he came out with a cover story on the Manson Revisited. And he turned that cover story into a book, which basically was his findings of the letters between CIA's MKUltra director, Sidney Gottlieb, and this top CIA MKUltra scientist, guy named Dr. Louis Julian Jolly West, who was very successful with using hypnosis and drugs to control people. And Dr. West is infamous for work with the Kennedys in terms of Lee Harvey Oswald, examining Lee Harvey Oswald, and dealing with Jack Ruby and causing Jack Ruby to go insane, and things like that. So he's a longtime player for U.S. intelligence. But what O'Neill revealed was his work with the Manson family for a number of months, where the Manson family was visiting him, at least once a week, if not daily, for many months at the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic. So I have a lot on that. And how
I have a friend who's a listener to the show who was she used to babysit for the people who ran that Haight-Ashbury Clinic, and they also had a daycare center. Did you know that?
Oh God, that's crazy.
Daycare center as well.
That's ridiculous. That's crazy. Yeah, because they had a CIA agent. I have in my film a CIA agent saying that the Manson family was getting LSD out of the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic. And so Dr. West had an office in the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, seeing them every day there. So it was really crazy. But the Manson family also was part of the Laurel Canyon drug and sex parties from 1968 onwards. And so they were living at Beach Boys drummer's house for at least 6 months, for example. And part of trying to push acid and other drugs on tons of celebrities.
That fellow, the young man who took the picture of John Lennon with Mark David Chapman, the last photograph of John Lennon alive. When you hear about this guy's background, he wanted to be a police officer. That was his dream, was to be a police officer. He was working as a security guard at the time. They call him today a photographer because he says, well, after I took that picture of Lennon, people like the Beach Boys wanted me to go visit them and be their photographer. Okay? So, there's so much. Yeah, right? Right? Oh, by the way, too, you talk about the great work of Dave McGowan. God bless him, man. Rest in peace, my friend.
Yeah.
And he always talked about how Jim Morrison, how his father was the admiral at the Gulf of Tonkin incident. I interviewed Jim Morrison's brother-in-law. Now, do you know he was mixed up with all those spooks and hitmen that were working for Larry Flint?
Wow.
Right.
I didn't know there was loads of spooks and hitmen working for Larry Flint, but that's interesting.
Oh, hell yeah, man. A guy saw a Process Church hitman, Bill Menser, was a Larry Flint guy. And also Mitch Rebel, Gordon Novell, all these spooks and hitmen were working for Larry Flint. But the thing is, too, is I found out that Morrison was very close to the admiral right up until his death. They weren't estranged in any kind of way. They were still very close. Yeah. They were still very close.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. Yeah, people that may not realize the admiral we're talking about is the one that started the Gulf of Tonkin incident, that started the Vietnam War. And so I get into that not only for Jim Morrison and so many musicians being kind of intimately used to promote drugs to the masses, but the fact that the Vietnam War, I showed the evidence that was for the kind of the Golden Triangle region of Vietnam, where the best opium, poppy fields are to make opium and heroin,
Right.
and of course have all that evidence of how the CIA and U.S. intelligence got the heroin from that area into the United States, and also used it to manipulate soldiers to keep them, fighting for them and stuff like that, and but mainly brought into the United States into communities of color and just in the United States in general to promote, just get addictions more, prevalent in the U.S. to control communities easier. And so, of course, it's the use of drugs for social control and to make a lot of money off it, because they made a ton of money off it, too.
There's a large portion of your film, too, deals with the Weather Underground and infiltration. What do you, looking back at this, what do you think? Was it created by intelligence forces or infiltrated by intelligence forces?
Well, it's a mix, I think.
Yeah.
To me, I mean, Students for Democratic Society was probably the best anti-war organization, in terms of like student organizations ever in the United States. They were 100,000 strong, hundreds of chapters, I believe, around the country. And here, the best and the brightest rose up in that group, such as Bernadine Dohrn, who's the main person I focus on in the film, but also Mike Klonsky, who came out of Columbia SDS, and even people like Mark Rudd, who I talk about in the film, who sadly enough got dosed by an undercover FBI agent, George Demerly, and his crazies. But all these guys were doing great work before they got dosed or influenced to just start taking acid, LSD or acid, and it's just a real shame that the undercover agents really just basically manipulated the leaders of the group, like Dohrn, sadly, because she was a great organizer, great organizer, and probably is just a great mind again. But during that time, she was highly manipulated, and so they effectively got SDS broken up. Now there was tons of infiltrators throughout SDS, sadly enough, with progressive labor, and even the New York Times admitted, I show in the film that they had at least one undercover agent in every chapter of the country, of SDS in the country, one infiltrator. And so they effectively break up SDS, and it really looks like that, these two particular undercover agents and others that were with them kind of wrote up the idea of forming the Weathermen. They wrote up the Weatherman Manifesto, and some Pulitzer Prize-winning writers who were researching this said that this one writer of this manifesto, this guy, I believe his name was William Mellon or whatever.
Right.
I forget that was his first name, but Mellon and Bill Ayers, wrote this manifesto, started the Weathermen, and convinced, and they had loads of people with them at Michigan SDS that sadly enough really divided Michigan SDS, and they were acting like thugs, and Bill Ayers just showed all kinds of horrible behavior that made him appear to be an undercover agent for his billionaire father.
And then when you look at his relationship later on with Obama, CIA product, it makes you wonder even more.
Yeah. Now, I, of course, don't go into anything about Obama. I've heard these things about Obama, and I tend to believe them, but I just don't know for sure, of course. But Bill Ayers himself has shown just so. I just document as much time as I have in the film to show it. The evidence of him being an undercover agent, at least the evidence of it, I can't be sure, of course. And then, starting the Weather Underground, manipulating the people in it. Now, the people in it, I think, were more, like Bernadine Dohrn was very sincere and sincerely did some good work as part of the Weather Underground to try to, go against the Vietnam War and stop the Vietnam War, stop, millions of people dying in the Vietnam War and all that. And I think there was a lot of sincere people in the Weather Underground. Now, they it might look like they started the bombing of institutions to stop the war, but really other activists around the country started the bombing of institutions to stop the war, and they just were the most famous people that were part of doing that. And but I think that was a sincere, just different tactic after trying so many other tactics to stop the Vietnam War and trying so many other different tactics to support the Black Panthers. But it did divide a lot of people. It really did, it did some good and some bad. I think overall it did a little more good than bad, possibly, but it's hard to know for sure. It's the key is though that they were definitely, these undercover agents definitely manipulated Bernie and Dorn to help break up SDS, and that was a massive blow for the anti-war movement. So that stopped. SDS arguably could have maybe helped at least stop the Vietnam War a few years earlier, had not been broken up. But some sincere members, there were some horrible members of the Weather Underground, like I believe like Bill Ayers and others that were manipulating people and doing some rough things. But then there was some well-meaning people in Weather Underground too. And the other sad thing about Weather Underground is they promoted LSD use inadvertently, like crazy, and that's I think just muddled people's minds a little too much, so that they couldn't do their best work against the oligarchs, U.S. intelligence forces that were pushing to keep the war going as long as possible, to get all that cheap heroin to take to stop the whatever communist movement in Vietnam. But that was just their decision, Vietnamese decision, that they wanted to become communists. It was, it's not something for us to argue about and to fight over. But that was obviously, the excuse of that war. When I really think the opiates were the real reason to that war. And nonetheless, it's what I can.
And looking back now, these groups, these homegrown activists, these homegrown revolutionaries, were doing prison breaks. They were breaking comrades out of prison. That had to be sincere, because I can see how that's a benefit to the oligarchs, like you say.
Yeah. Well, yeah. No, So I think the fact that the Weathermen did help. Forget what their prison breaks. Yeah, I mean, they apparently were supposedly helping break Asad Shakur out of prison.
Right.
So they were doing some good stuff in that regard, but they also were kind of manipulated into breaking Timothy Leary out of prison.
Well, that was the Brotherhood of Eternal Love or whatever. And when in 1977, when I first went to Yippie headquarters and I talked to Fred Gottbetter, who was a spokesman person over there, and I mentioned Timothy Leary. The first thing he said out of his mouth, and these were the yippies, like you mentioned before, the crazies and the Demerol, clearly was a problem. But the thing
started by Abby Hoffman and all.
Right, but right away they said, no, man, Timothy Leary was an agent, and when he supposedly escaped down telephone wires out of this mental institution, that's not how it happened at all. These guys pulled up. He was sitting there at a bus stop, man. Who knows how he got out of that building? They probably walked him out of there.
So, that's funny. That's funny. Yeah, well, I'm glad the Yippies knew that Timothy Leary was an agent, because it came out in two interviews. Yeah. Well, a major interview in two different books came out with the fact that Timothy Leary admitted, that he knew he was working for the CIA since at least 1963. And so, yeah, he was definitely an agent that was, used to promote acid like crazy to kind of
friends with that guy from the Watergate burglary, that guy G. Gordon Liddy, and I think he had an open marijuana case his entire public life. What more do you want?
Right. So, it's a weird, wild history. No doubt, there's so much to it. So it is so comic. I mean, that's why it's so easy to make this film partly a dark comedy, because there's so many comic elements to it. It's so ridiculous. But like Timothy Leary's life is so ridiculous. I just had to make fun of his death, especially with his sending his ashes into space and all.
When we look at your film, okay, CIA drugs are us. There is a thread throughout this. The oligarchs, they control the entertainment industry. They control the opiates, the opioids to lull us into submission. They control the opposition. The revolutionary, they control the revolution movement, the opposition against it. But then they also utilize trauma-based mind control, sexual abuse of children.
Yeah. Yeah, they use trauma plus hypnosis plus
Right.
drugs to create assets, CIA assets, meaning, people that they create dissociative disorder or dissociative identity disorder in people, and then lead them to live double lives without them even knowing it. And that's super scary, of course. And that's what some of the Manson followers were. They used those techniques on the Manson followers, as the evidence shows. Plus, they use them on people involved in the Catholic, churches' sex abuse scandals, which happened around the country. And, of course, that's the last part of my film, is covering in particular the one in the situation in Maryland that, was highlighted in an Emmy-nominated film called The Keepers, about this father, Joseph Maskell. And I end up showing all the evidence around him and his connections to the CIA's MKUltra, which whose name changed, but it was basically, the operations still existed, still kept going. President Kennedy tried to close down MKUltra, but they kept it going behind his back. He found out it was going, behind his back again. It was still going, and he tried to close it down a second time, so they changed the name to MK Search, but they kept it going, long term. And either way, so when Maskell was doing what he was doing for probably from the late 50s onwards to at least the early to mid 1990s, I'm sorry, it's just shows that the techniques he was using, hypnosis, he was using drugs, he was raping tons of high school girls and boys and some boys, and pimping them out to people. And he was also had a back door to his office in the Archbishop Keough High School, which was a Catholic girls' school, which sadly enough happens to be within a few miles of where I live in Baltimore. And he was letting in policemen in the back door. He was letting in photographers. He was letting in all kinds of people, and even had some of these girls, having sex with politicians. He was filming these things and using them for, I argue he was probably using them for blackmail purposes. But there's just so much to that operation that shows that it was part of, CIA's MKUltra program, and I get into that in depth. And I was really happy to get the help of Gemma Hoskins, who was the star of that documentary series, The Keepers. With her, in 2017 when they first came out, I just kind of saw it, thought it was a great documentary, but there was just something lacking there. And what I did is I just contacted Gemma Hoskins, and she was a citizen investigator in the film, who was the main thread of the whole film, and they showed her investigating everything that happened. And she graduated from Archbishop Keough High School in 1969, and her favorite teacher was Sister Kathy Sesnick, who the film was also about, because when Sister Kathy Sesnick found out about Maskell from all these her classmates, her students who were, getting abused by Maskell, she tried, threatened to come out with it all and stop it, and she was murdered. And so Gemma Hoskins had Sister Kathy Sesnick as a teacher in 1969, and then ended up investigating it with the Keepers. But so 2017 when it came out, I sent pages of a book called The CIA Doctors by a psychiatrist who was very well recognized in the field for his work. And I said, I believe that this is actually, Maskell has so much power and is so untouchable because he's doing work with the CIA. And here's some pages from this CIA doctor's book that can show some of the evidence of his techniques were also being used by the CIA's MKUltra. And the doctor that defended him in court, Johns Hopkins psychiatric director, Bill McHugh, I believe his name was, he's got a history of being connected to CIA type programs, such as the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, and the CIA director before him, maybe a few directors before him, was actually head of a group called the Human Ecology Fund at one point, and and the Human Ecology Fund was the CIA front company. And so, that's just some of the evidence, and of course there's much more around that, but it's just, that's very important because some of these victims end up, talking about what they were turned into, they believe they were turned into programmed operatives, because they realized after much counseling that they might have dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality disorder, or at least dissociative disorder, which is selective, where you go into amnesia for things you did for hours at a time, and they have ways of programming that through their techniques. So.
And you were talking about how Sirhan was involved with hypnosis, and
yes, yeah.
And then you also mentioned too, John Lennon too was exposed to hypnosis through Yoko Ono, and there's a great new film out by May Pang.
I didn't touch on Lennon with hypnosis, but I just definitely touched on the evidence against Yoko Ono for manipulating Lennon and getting him back into using acid again and introducing him to heroin and stuff. Sure.
Yeah, there's a great new film by May Pang called The Lost Weekend, a Love Story. You could probably find it online. And the gloves are off as far as Yoko goes with this. When I had her on the show a second time to talk about that new film, she still backed away again. From saying it. She's afraid to let the words out of her mouth. But in the film, they're very, very. The gloves are off on Yoko in that film. I recommend it to everybody. I'm in the film. I'm in CIA Drugs R Us, okay? Not because of my drug smuggling days, but because of my friendship with Hank Harrison.
Right. And so, thanks for telling me about The Lost Weekend. She actually, May Pang, I just want to tell you, came over to Baltimore, and I meant to see her with her, I guess, photograph display.
Yeah. I went down to Naples to see that, yeah.
Yeah, I just didn't get a chance to get over there, but I wanted to. I didn't know she had a film, and the gloves were off when Yoko Ono. That sounds good. I'd like to see that film.
Excellent.
For sure. But so I really like our collaborative work with Hank Harrison because you did a great interview of him and invited me to come and ask some more questions of him during that interview, and I appreciate that, Ed, because he comes out. So Hank Harrison, is the biological father of Courtney Love, if people don't know that, and he comes out with a book, Love Kills: The Assassination of Kurt Cobain, and he implicates his daughter as being involved in the murder of Kurt Cobain, and it's pretty incredible that history he gives of Courtney Love, and so there's only so much I could cover of all that in a film. Of course, I have so much more in 2 chapters of my book. But it's pretty amazing. It's great that you interviewed him and got him to say a lot of interesting stuff about how he got a letter. And so when he came out with the book, he came out with it as a PDF version just online, and he sent it to loads of people for free, including myself. And so I read it very carefully, took loads of notes, and asked Hank myself for an interview. And I interviewed him and just really pressed him on some of the key points. Because the original PDF was very long and rambling, but yet it had some gems in it for the topic I was researching, of course. And so one of them was a letter from the CIA, where he says this guy who became friends with Hank when he was researching a book in Dublin, Ireland, around was it the 1980s. This guy befriends him and then starts having sex with a 17-year-old daughter. His 16-year-old daughter, actually, Courtney Love, visited him and just turned 17. And here this guy befriends Hank Harrison and then starts having sex with his daughter. And meanwhile, Hank Harrison said when she was visiting him, she was prostituting on the streets of Dublin when she visited him in Dublin. And the best evidence is that she was actually sexually abused from the age of maybe 2, 3, or 4 years old. It started onwards by her counselors, by these counselors that her estranged mother, Linda Carroll, kind of sent her to. And she says her counselors were also giving her all kinds of psychohypnotic drugs. Now, this is more in depth in my book, but in the film I mentioned some of that. And And then, Hank Harrison said that she turned into a serious, heroin addict, and he couldn't, and was prostituting herself, and then a CIA agent, he didn't know he was a CIA agent at the time, but a guy who befriended him starts leading Courtney Love over to London, where she brought 1,000 hits of very strong acid and passed it out to loads of musicians in the rising scene in different areas of England, Liverpool and all that, to people like Adam Ant, people probably know Echo and the Bunnymen, and different other groups, the Pogues. Slept with a lot of them, tried to disrupt the bands, and really mess them up. And she duplicated that in cities throughout the United States too, until she got to Kurt Cobain, who she helped form a heroin addiction at a time when he becomes like the leading kind of figure in the United States in terms of just top musician, beloved musician, and inadvertently promoting heroin. Sadly, the way John Lennon was manipulated to inadvertently promote heroin and LSD, and you saw the addiction population in heroin rise dramatically throughout the years of Nirvana and grunge in the early 1990s onwards. But she was heavily behind it, and turns out it appears that she was being manipulated by the O'Learys, and so it's very...
Yeah, and that's Kevin Leary from Shark Tank, Mr. Wonderful. And we've seen them photographed together. He was the brother who was higher up in the CIA.
Yeah, right. And you really questioned Hank well about that, to get him to talk about that more. And we don't know for sure if it's the same Kevin O'Leary, but they show video of them together just in the past 5 or 10 years, So, he says that this is the same Kevin O'Leary. I show evidence backing that the obituary of Stephen O'Leary, who sent him the letter, said, "I'm on my deathbed, but I'm dying, and I found evidence of where he died," and just what way Hank said it. And then here's a guy who has a brother named Kevin O'Leary. And then here's Courtney Love. He says he was helping Steve O'Leary take Courtney Love around England, to all these musical scenes with all these drugs. And then here, 30 years later, there's Courtney Love again hanging out with Kevin O'Leary. So it's an awfully big coincidence if it's just a coincidence.
Well, we filmed it at Hank's house. We filmed it in Hank's house. We were going to do a little documentary film with Hank. And he was going to be one part of it. And at one point, he says, "Ed, they're all named Leary. Some of them are named Leary O'Leary." But the thing with Hank was, you love him or hate him, man, whatever. You had to take a lot of what he said with a grain of salt, And he's definitely had some kind of a colorful life for sure.
So that's why I couldn't use a lot of his book, but the parts of his book that I could find backing documentation, I show that backing documentation in the film.
And in connection to all the same people, the Merry Pranksters, the Grateful Dead. He dated one of the Manson women. Okay, he showed me a picture.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Jeez.
I know, man. It's like
crazy.
Crazy is one way to put it, man. Oh, and also too, then you highlighted her connection to Jeffrey Epstein. She is in the Jeffrey Epstein address book.
Right, one of the few women in the Jeffrey Epstein address book that the housekeeper for Jeffrey Epstein, the house manager, said had direct evidence, and saw the sexual abuse of young kids taking place, and so he circled a few. He had hundreds of names of super influential, powerful people around the country, but only a few dozen, he circled that said these people had direct knowledge of this abuse going on, and she was one of the few women of all those dozens, circled that had the direct knowledge. The house manager for Epstein said.
Oh boy, what about this group? I found it interesting. You talk at the end about this group called MAPS.
Yeah, so it's a multidisciplinary association of psychedelic studies. And I show the evidence that that's just a latter-day Human Ecology Fund, which was the CIA front group. And the Anthropology Today has a long article talking about how Human Ecology Fund was a CIA front group promoting, all these drugs. And here comes MAPS and the Hefter Institute as two basically new versions of the Human Ecology Fund. And the evidence supports that they're They're doing the same thing that the Human Ecology Fund was doing. They have the same funders. The Rockefellers were heavily funding the Human Ecology Fund, that CIA front group, for the MKUltra, experiments. And now MAPS and Hefter are getting loads of Rockefeller money and other billionaires' money to do the same thing, to fund, use of LSD and other drugs like MDMA, ecstasy or Molly, it's called, on the street, at these, different universities around the country, such as Columbia, Hopkins, Harvard, et cetera, to promote, say, hey, it's a great new technique for treating PTSD, or it's great for treating depression, or everything else. And thankfully, the FDA finally did something right and good in saying that their advisory panel said that MDMA in the experiments should not be legalized. Legal or not legal is not the issue, but qualifying it as an actual, therapeutic for trauma when it causes, brain damage of sorts like memory loss and stuff. All the best evidence has said that for decades, because it affects serotonin. I forget which receptors exactly it affects, but it hurts the memory area of the brain for sure. And so, it's just bad news, though, that they're promoting it up a storm, so it doesn't even matter what the FDA advisory panel says. They might, the FDA might go against their own advisory panel. They've done it before. And it's already been promoted so much as, look, Hopkins or Harvard or Columbia and all are using this for trauma, so you should too, and so.
Right, and in your film, you start off with the opiate trade, and when you see how big that opium factory was, you really, it totally changes your perception of this. And then when we saw that big heroin factory in Afghanistan get bombed during Trump, and you saw how big this thing was, it was like bigger than a Walmart, it was huge. But you say about how this opium money went to create these colleges like Columbia and Harvard, correct? Right.
Yeah, so that's the beginning of the film. Right. Yeah, how opium, enriching, all this opium enriched families, these wealthiest families, to start these Ivy League schools, and then they kept using these Ivy League schools to sadly promote other drugs, come into the current day, with promoting psychedelics that can hurt people's minds, promoting the MDMA, the ecstasy and stuff.
There's a whole bunch of books out recently, and I've had these people as guests on the show promoting LSD for treatment of depression and microdosing psilocybin mushrooms for treating depression. And I'll corner these guys and say, well, what about Larry? He was an agent, right? No, he was a great guy. So right away you get suspicious, right? But what do you think about mushrooms or microdosing psilocybin mushrooms for treatment depression and these kind of things?
Yeah, well, I don't know. Don't talk about mushrooms as much, but with the acid, I remember, just as an example, I was counseling years ago when I was doing a little more addictions counseling. I was counseling. This is about maybe I had a percentage still of addictions counseling back in, say, 2013, 14, and the other percentage was trauma and other stuff. But I had this girl. His father took this girl to see me. She was 16 or 17 years old, and she said she was really, and I happened to start telling her a little bit about the stuff about psychedelics, and she says, that all makes sense, because I was doing child acting in a local theater, and it was so easy to remember my lines. I just read the script and know my lines really quickly. Everything was great. And when I was about 16 or so, I tried some microdosing, some acid, and all of a sudden I couldn't remember my lines anymore. It was so hard to remember my lines for my acting. And she says, that makes sense now. I'm not going to do that crap anymore. And I just think that's what people don't realize. It's it's having a negative effect. And so, does it help with trauma or not? Who knows? But is it worth it? Losing your memory, losing your memory abilities. I'm not saying losing your memory completely, but losing memory abilities. And there's so many other issues that it can affect. That the best treatment for trauma is EMDR, and more it's getting more and more mainstream acceptance. It's not invasive. It's just
what is EMDR?
Triggers. It's called eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Really? Is really just about stimulating the brain, the right hemisphere and left hemisphere, back and forth, either with eye movement by watching a pen go back and forth, or vibrations going back and forth in each hand, in different speeds. and it stimulates the brain to use more of itself. To then, and if you do it in a fast way while remembering a particular trauma, it pulls that trauma out of the memory area and starts to process it in a healthier way with a therapist who's been trained in it, like myself, in a guided way. It really is the most non-invasive but effective technique of stimulating the brain to heal itself of these traumas. And these traumas act as magnifiers for smaller triggers in your current life, where the current life trigger, small trigger, ends up going through the magnification of the trauma and then triggers the amygdala, which is the fight or flight area. So you go into fight or flight mode too easily. So
fascinating, man. We got to have you come back and just talk about that. I've never heard of this before. Sure. This is fascinating stuff. But and you end the film with CIA Drugs Are Us. You end this film. You can find it at johnpotash.com. Talking about how, hey, we got like a marijuana store on every corner. Down here in Florida, there's a pot store on every freaking corner, man. Yeah. Now, suddenly, what? They want everybody smoking pot, like house cats at home, like you said. What do you make of that, man?
Yeah, I mean, if people want to smoke weed, that's fine. The problem is the oligarchs are just rolling us over. They're just like rolling over us while we're busy getting high. And, I have no problem with people want to smoke weed. I don't care if it's legal or not legal. Legal is fine. It's just that when so many people are getting stoned all the time, we're just not at our sharpest to fight the oligarchs as they just take over our lives slowly but surely, more and more. And that's what sadly appears to be happening, Yeah,
you could throw in a whole nother segment, too, in part 3 of this great work you're doing here, CIA Drugs Are Us. Video games. Okay, man, what's going on with that?
Right.
Sitting home hypnotized by these video games.
I agree. I know.
John Potash, man, thank you so much. We're out of time. I want to have you back in a couple of weeks, though. I'll watch the film again. I think we could do like 6 shows on this thing, right?
Sure, yeah, whatever. Yeah, however much you want. No. Yeah, that'd be great, Ed.
Yeah, come on. It's insane how much content is in this movie. CIA Drugs Are Us. The first one is Drugs as Weapons Against Us. Watch that one first. And then check out CIA Drugs Are Us. Great stuff here. John Potash, man. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me on again, Ed.
Good night, brother.
Take care.
Bye.